A deadly shooting spree there that left 8 people dead. The gunman allegedly targeted 3 different spas in the area. And I want to bring in our Steve Osinsami, who's on the phone. He's been covering this story for us, as well as former FBI agent Brad Garrett. Steve, one of the big questions surrounding this case is whether or not these attacks were racially motivated, whether or not this gunman was trying to target victims of Asian descent. The police say the investigation is still in early stages, and so they can't say for sure if there was any kind of a hate crime at play. But the big revelation seems to be that the suspect told investigators that he blames these massage parlors for providing an outlet for his addiction to sex. How big is that revelation, and what does that do for this case?
Well, it's something that we've been hearing all night, actually, without a question, most of the people who were killed in this horrific attack at 3 different locations were Asian women. In fact, these were Asian businesses. But we have been hearing that it was more than that. And what they shared today sort of underlines that they believe that he was struggling with some sort of sex addiction. We were seeing he has a church that he is a member of, and that church took down its website. They at one point said they were going to issue a statement. He was seen on that church website as recent as 2018 recording a video. He has a youth pastor. So if he's struggling with a sex addiction, this paints a slightly more complicated picture than I think that people were seeing in this case. That doesn't mean that investigators have ruled out the racial component here. They are still absolutely investigating that. The FBI is here, so if there is the possibility of hate crimes, the FBI is here to pursue that. But it does appear that the sex addiction part of the story that we're hearing, a motivation, is what investigators are focusing on. I will tell you, as a longtime resident of the city, and I don't live terribly far from this location. It's an area of town where there are a lot of strip clubs, where the spas, in this case, are open. The 2 in Atlanta were open 24 hours. But as the mayor of Atlanta, as you just heard, points out, these are all legal businesses, and they are not victim blaming. And no matter what kind of business this was, none of these people, of course, should have been killed. Absolutely. And I will also share something else that investigators share, that they're having a little difficulty talking to witnesses because some of the people who they need to talk with are sex workers. So I think that this investigation is going to continue. They're going to continue to look at the race of these victims because most of them were Asian. But as you just heard, the sex addiction is where they're focusing on in terms of what may have been the greater or possibly the main motive.
And Brad, when you look at the law enforcement response here, the other big thing that seems to have come out of this press conference is the idea that this attack, as bad as it was, could actually have been far worse. When you heard the police describing how they coordinated between different departments and how they coordinated with the suspect's family, the family contacting police and saying they recognized him from the photos and images being circulated on social media, how do you think the response went here, and how much worse do you think this attack could have been?
So this went together like it's supposed to, where you have city, county, state, and federal agencies immediately coming together. Fortunately, as you mentioned, they got the family on board that I think gave them additional leads as to where he might be headed, what vehicle he's in, et cetera. So it allowed them to get out to the state police a vehicle, and I presume that's how they stopped him 150 miles from Atlanta. But this is also, Diane, a great example of how law enforcement can only do their job quickly if the community/witnesses help them. And that's why this went together, I think, unbelievably fast. To your other point about that he apparently was heading to Florida, quote unquote, to do the same thing, I mean, this was ultimately going to end probably in him being in a shootout with the police at maybe at some other spa or something similar to the spa. So a great situation of as horrible as this is, that it was stopped.
Does it surprise you, given that narrative, that they say that he didn't resist arrest? How much credit do you think law enforcement deserves for the way they were able to bring the suspect in?
Well, you know, it's one of those situations where you don't know if you're a state trooper, an FBI agent, whomever. I've done this where I've pulled people over that I really didn't know much about them. And so you take every safety precaution, but you don't overreact, because clearly you don't want to get into a shootout with him, which obviously could affect your safety, but other people around you, cars passing by, etc. So whoever stopped him, two things went on. They did a great job, and apparently he didn't want to put up a fight. And that may tell you or suggest to you that he has maybe a lot of guilt about what he has done, and he doesn't really want to harm anybody else, or at least he doesn't want to harm law enforcement. But a peaceful ending to something that could have been much different than what we have.
And Brad, the police continued to say that this investigation is still in very early stages. So they have the suspect in custody. It sounds like he's talking to them and he's admitted to this crime. So where does the investigation go from here?
So the key is going to be a couple of things. One is, what was the true motivation? I get the sex addiction part of it that Steve talked about. But is there something deeper to it? Do we even know if there is an ethnic overlay to this? We just don't know at this point. It might be just because of these particular locations, the people that work there are of Asian descent. But you really want to know motivation, where the gun came from, and had he planned anything else? Had he talked to anyone else about this? Diane, the key with these kind of shootings is that if you learn everything possible about the shooting, it can then help you potentially with the next act.
And Steve, this admission by the suspect, him telling investigators that he blames, the women at this establishment or these establishments in general for providing an outlet for his addiction to sex, seems to come at an interesting time, in that the Sarah Everard story that we've seen in London, the young woman who a police officer is now charged with murdering and kidnapping when she was walking home, that story is fueling a global narrative about sexism against women and about reclaiming safety on our streets. The idea that this suspect is telling investigators that he killed these people because he sees these outlets and these victims as being responsible for his sex addiction, what does that do for that global conversation?
Well, I think there are a lot of people who would say that, that argument is anti-women. It's he has a sex addiction and it's the woman's fault. It's the sex worker's fault. When I first heard this, I shook my head. The idea that would justify the idea that would justify a killing is just is ludicrous. And so, but that does appear to be what investigators think may have been the one of the motives here. They're not ruling out the other possible motives, but that's one that they're really focusing on. And it's changed the conversation a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that these women were killed. Most of them were Asian, and some of them, we don't know, their legal status, according to, I think, the Korean consulate, which believes that most of these women may have been Korean. So, and investigators have a lot of work to do still. And yes, this does change the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, they sure do have their work cut out for them now. And Brad, I just want to ask one more question. When there was a suspicion that this may have been racially motivated, and again, police still don't know if that was another underlying motive here, but there seemed to be a lot of concern about perhaps copycat crimes going out there, particularly because we've seen this rise in aggression against people in the Asian community here in the U.S. So now that the suspect is offering this idea that, he was targeting these areas because he blamed them for his sex addiction, does that change at all the concerns about a possible copycat kind of crime happening here? Are police going to be going around to other businesses like this and telling them to be on high alert?
every time, Diane, there's a mass shooting, we're always concerned about copycats. And it really doesn't matter what the motive was as far as the copycat part of this. Keep in mind that mass shooters are all driven, and this goes to one of Steve's points, are driven by externalizing their problems. It's society's fault. It's these women who work at these spas. It's their fault. They externalize everything. And there's probably things in his life that happened that may have driven in this direction. But we'll have to see how that shakes out. But the reality is, yes, I am concerned about people copying this who want to commit mass shootings, not necessarily at the targets that this guy picked.
All right, Brad Garrett and Steve Osunsami, we appreciate you guys taking the time to break this down for us. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
And the UK government is announcing plans to make women and girls feel safer through a nationwide rollout of a program called Project Vigilant. The move comes after the death of Sarah Everard. A London police officer is now charged with her murder and kidnapping after Everard vanished while walking home in London. Now, as I mentioned, her death has sparked a global movement against street harassment and violence. Foreign correspondent Maggie Rulli joins us live from London now with the latest. Maggie, good morning. What do we know about Everard's case so far and the officer charged with her murder and kidnapping?
Hey, Diane, good morning. Yeah, we got that shocking news. Everard was missing for quite some time, and then we learned the police actually arrested a serving police officer. He was in his 40s. He's arrested and charged with Sarah's kidnapping and her murder. So clearly shocking, and led many women questioning the fact that these are the people that are supposed to be protecting women and men on the streets. Now one of them is a suspect. So a lot of grief, a lot of anger from women and men here in London, and a lot of women that we met at some of the memorials and vigils that have popped up around London for Sarah. They all say the same thing. They say, this could have been me. Sarah was walking home just after 9:30 at night. She took a well-lit route home through an area of London that's popular with young people. She kind of took all the precautions. She was wearing sneakers so she could walk and run in. She was wearing bright clothing. She texted her boyfriend saying she was on her way home. One young girl we spoke with at the memorial said, Sarah did everything right. She did all the things that women are taught to do to stay safe from a young age, and it still happened to her. And that is why you see this grief sort of boiling over into anger right now, Diane, because I think all women can relate to doing those things that we're taught to do from the young age, carrying your keys in your fist in case you have to attack someone, calling a friend, having an open line. These are things we always do. And the fact that it happened to Sarah really drives that fear home for so many women.
Yep, I have done all of those things, Maggie. I'm sure you have too. So over the last week, Everard's death has inspired this Reclaim the Streets movement. What are we seeing from that? What are advocates trying to get done here?
Yeah, it's really been empowering, Diane. Obviously, people are mourning the tragic death of Sarah, but it's also become this movement. You may even be seeing it in the States. I've seen a lot of people, both American and British and from all over the world, posting things on their Instagram, like, text me when you get home. I'm sure you've said that to your friends as well. Kind of this collective moment for women of grief and fear and anger, because we know what it's like. We've all texted that to friends. And so we're seeing this movement. It's gone online. It is on social media. We're now seeing the hashtag Reclaim These Streets, raising money, raising awareness. And, we actually spoke to a lawmaker here in the UK, Diane, that's been on the forefront of this. She was part of the Reclaim the Streets movement back in the 70s when this first started. She told us, she can't believe she's talking to me. 2021, nearly 50 years she's been fighting this fight, and we're still talking about it. And she said in this moment of sort of frustration and grief, she heard some of the police here, after this murder, tell women, well, don't go out at night. And her response, off the cuff, out of frustration, she goes, how about we stop telling women to not go out at night? Instead, let's put a curfew on men. I'm going to propose a bill that says no men are allowed out after 6. They're the ones who are violent anyway. Now, she admits this is impossible and was sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but the reaction she's getting is pretty incredible. And a lot of women are standing up saying, enough is enough. Why are we blaming the victim? Why don't we take a stance and try to stop the people who are perpetrating this violence instead? So, really interesting. This conversation is still going on. People are demanding that something changes.
And I know tensions are also high there in London, and a lot of controversy being paid attention to over the encounter between police and demonstrators around this case. Can you elaborate a little bit on what happened there and what the reaction is?
Yeah, Diane, keep talking about sort of this anger boiling over, people really just saying, again, enough is enough. And we saw that happen. A vigil was planned. You see some of these images here. They're tough to look at. This was a vigil that was planned for Sarah. And because of COVID protocols, the protesters were told not to gather, that it broke COVID rules here in London. We're still under a pretty severe lockdown. So there was a police presence. Now, we're not sure exactly what happened. There are varying accounts, but you see that video and you can see police officers getting very aggressive with a young woman who was there protesting. And, you know, for many women, they just said these images alone. Here you have people who are at a vigil for a woman who was allegedly murdered by a serving police officer. He is their lead suspect, and you have police getting rough with a woman who's there protesting. So that alone is something that many people right now in the city police department are having to answer for.
All right, Maggie Rulli in London for us. Maggie, thanks so much. And we will have more on this story today at 3 p.m. Eastern on The Breakdown. But the sad truth is violence against women happens every day. Last week, the World Health Organization reported that 1 in 3 women, around 736 million, will suffer physical or sexual violence at some point. So what is it about Sarah Everard's story that has sparked this international conversation? Laura Bates, the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project and author of Men Who Hate Women, is here to tell us more about this. Laura, good morning. I'm sad to have you here on a day that this seems so much more topical given the press conference we just heard out of Atlanta. And I want to get to that in a second. But first, what is it about Everard's case that seems to be a tipping point when it comes to this conversation about violence against women? Is it the fact that she seems to have done everything right? As Maggie explained, she took a well-lit route home. She was wearing her sneakers. She texted her boyfriend. Is that what's making this case take on this global voice?
Well, I think in part it resonates with women who have been indoctrinated to think that we have to take these precautions. I think that many women can picture themselves in that situation, walking home, taking all of those precautions. So that does bring it very close to home. But there is also an element here of the stories that the media chooses to platform. And of course, this idea that she did everything she was supposed to do, she was just walking home, has trended around the world. It really shows us that we are more prepared to listen to and sympathize with some victims of sexual and domestic and male violence than others. There have been other recent cases of older women, women of colour here in the UK who have gone missing and been murdered, and the same level of outcry hasn't happened. So in part, I think we have a media lens here of sort of institutionalised misogyny and racism around which victims we choose to listen to and which stories we choose to raise up. Of course, this is an incredibly tragic case, and it's right that there is this outcry. But less than a year ago, 2 black women were murdered here in the UK in a park, again, just outside London. And police officers in that case were found to have taken selfies of themselves next to the bodies, the dead bodies of 2 black women. We didn't see the same level of public outcry there. So I think there are a number of issues going on here. And
just now we finished hearing this press conference out of Atlanta of a shooting spree that happened there. The suspect is thought to have killed 8 victims here. And he is apparently telling investigators that he targeted these massage parlors because he blames them for essentially enabling his sex addiction. When you tie these cases together, what do you think we as the press and the public in general needs to keep in mind when we're looking at a case like this?
Well, I think we have to be very mindful of speculating before motive has been proven. But what I would say is that again and again, when there are cases where women are massacred by men, we don't necessarily even pause to point that out. The news coverage of this particular tragic case in Atlanta has quite rightly raised issues and concerns around abuse against Asian Americans. But I've seen very little coverage that has mentioned the fact that the vast majority of victims were also women, and women working in a particular profession. And if you have a look, for example, at a case that's been recently in Toronto where a teenage boy walked into a massage parlor and attacked 2 women with a machete, killing one of them, the misogyny in that case was proven to be the motive that was going on. So I think we need to recognize that when men attack women, we don't necessarily even stop to recognize male violence as the issue. And we often don't even consider the possibility of extremist misogyny as a motive in these crimes, though we are prepared to consider the possibility of other motives. And of course, in many cases, there can be more than one of those motives that are very much intersectional.
And back to the Everard case, how significant do you think it is that it's a police officer that's charged with her murder and kidnapping?
I think it's extremely significant. And in fact, he isn't the only police officer to have been charged with a crime like this. This week in the UK, another police officer has also been charged with rape and sexual assault. There is rightful anger here about the institutionalized racism and misogyny in a system that is completely failing to protect women and girls. Here in the UK, just 1.5% of rape cases reported to the police results in a charge or summons. Rape has essentially been decriminalized. And so I think it's right that people are extremely angry that the police officers who have been involved in these cases, the police officers taking selfies of themselves next to murder victims. Another police officer in this case has been suspended for sending jokes about the victim and about the crime scene to other police officers. So I think we are right to be saying there is a systemic institutional issue here within our criminal justice system. And until we tackle that, we can't just say that women and girls should come forward to the police, because we can't guarantee that they'll be safe when they do.
And earlier you said that extreme misogyny can be a motive in some of these cases, but you've also said that this sort of violence can stem from low-level, normalized sexism and discrimination against women being ingrained in our society. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the response from this has been to treat it as an isolated incident. But of course, what we're really looking at is a pattern. If we live in a society where the lower level, more normalized incidents are excused, for example, just this week in the UK, we've had a study show that 97% of young women are sexually harassed in public spaces. But if we try to speak up about that, we're often told that we're overreacting, that catcalls are compliments, that we should just learn to enjoy it. But if we designate women's body as public property in public spaces, which is what we're really doing when we minimize those other forms of sexism, those lower level things, we're creating a power imbalance in our society, and that has a massive impact in the way in which we view and think about violence against women. It's not to say that one leads directly to the other, but certainly that if we let these attitudes go unchecked and unchallenged, they create a more fertile ground, if you like, from which some of the more serious abuses can more easily spring. And if we don't recognize that spectrum and those connections, then it's a very difficult problem to tackle.
And now we're seeing women around the world speaking out, sharing their stories of harassment. But what do you think it will take to get real substantive change here?
Well, I think we need to see policymakers and organizational leaders step up. Women are incredibly courageously, once again, and of course we've seen this in recent years, once again pouring out a collective cry of grief and rage, sharing their stories. What we need is for people to listen, and not just listen and say, wow, that's shocking, but listen and do something about it. We need to see sexual offences taken more seriously. We need to see better funding for frontline sexual violence services. We need to see legislation to tackle sexual offences in public spaces that doesn't really exist here in the UK for these lower level issues. We need to see education and policymakers making sure that young people are taught about sexual consent and healthy relationships at school, instead of just teaching girls not to wear short skirts. So I think a number of really concrete shifts that we could see that would make a difference here.
All right, Laura Bates of the Everyday Sexism Project, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're going to turn now to part 2 of George Stephanopoulos' exclusive interview with President Biden. They discussed everything from what's next on Biden's agenda to his relationship with Vice President Harris to even his dog, Major. Let's listen.
You're out here selling your COVID relief package. You're executing the COVID relief package now as well. What's next on your legislative agenda?
If you notice the criticism of the COVID relief package from my Republican friends is they say it spends too much money and it gives too many tax breaks. All these tax breaks go to the bottom 60% of the population. And guess what? They need it. The $1,400 check, child care tax credit. They don't like it because, in fact, their idea of a tax cut is to give the Trump tax cut where 83% went to the top 1% of the people in America.
You're going to be raising those taxes.
Yes, anybody making more than $400,000 will see a small to a significant tax increase. If you make less than $400,000, you won't see one single penny in additional federal tax.
But let's talk raw politics here. You didn't get a single Republican vote for tax cuts. How are you going to get a Republican vote for a tax increase?
I may not get but I'll get the Democratic votes for a tax increase. If we just took the tax rate back to what it was when Bush was president, top rate paid 39.6% in federal taxes. That would raise $230 billion. Yet they're complaining because I'm providing a tax credit for childcare? For the poor, for the middle class?
You just say you're not likely to get Republican votes for the tax increase. You're not likely to get Republican votes for H.R. 1, expanding voting rights, or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So aren't you going to have to choose? I know you've been reluctant to do away with the filibuster. Aren't you going to have to choose between preserving the filibuster and advancing your agenda?
Yes. But here's the choice. I don't think you have to eliminate the filibuster. You have to do it what it used to be when I first got to the Senate, and that is that a filibuster, you had to stand up and command the floor. Once you stopped talking, you lost that, and someone could move in and say, I moved the question of. So you got to work for the filibuster.
So you're for that reform. You're for bringing back the talking filibuster.
I am. That's what it was supposed to be.
Just put a hold on it, that's it.
Yeah. It almost is getting to the point where democracy's having a hard time functioning. I'm not saying this is going to be easy, George. But I do believe there's enough Republicans over time.
They haven't had that epiphany you said you were going to see in the campaign.
No, well, I've only been here 6 weeks, pal. Okay, give me a break. Been here 6 weeks. I think the epiphany is going to come between now and 2022. 78% of the people say they support this program. 52% of Republicans. Republican voters want to be able to choose between being able to send their kid to a daycare that they can afford. It's not like every Republican voter is a billionaire.
You probably walked into the Oval Office as president with about as much experience, if not more experience, than any other president who's ever served. More than 3 decades in the Senate, 8 years as vice president. So what is it about the job that surprised you, that even you didn't know?
What has surprised me is that I'm not as surprised as I thought I might be. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's like sitting, when I was vice president, the big difference is that famous expression of Harry Truman, the buck stops here. For 8 years, I had a great relationship and still do with Barack. And I'd always be the last person in the room. And I'd say, throw the pass or run the ball. And I'd give my opinion. I was the last guy, and I get to leave. But he's all by himself to have to make that decision. That's the big difference.
Is Vice President Harris the last person in the room?
Most of the time, yes. As a practical matter, yeah, she is.
One final question.
Sure.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
Yeah. The answer is yes. Major was a rescue pup. Major did not bite someone and penetrate the skin. And the dog's being trained now. Our trainer at home in Delaware, he was going home. I didn't banish him to home. Jill was going to be away for 4 days. I was going to be away for 2, so we took him home. But you turn a corner, and there's 2 people who don't know at all, and, and they move, and he moves to protect. But he's a sweet dog. 85% of the people there love him. All he does is lick them and wag his tail.
And you'll see him tonight?
I'm going to see him tonight, yeah.
Mr. President, thanks for your time.
Thank you, George. I appreciate it.
And our thanks to George for that interview. And that does it for this ABC News Live update. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for joining us. And remember, ABC News Live is here for you all day with the latest news, context, and analysis. I'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Eastern with Terry Moran for the breakdown. Stay safe. Have a great day.